The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, the heat shimmering in waves above the gas station pumps. It was the kind of day that made the air feel heavy, thick with the promise of a long, blistering summer. The station sat off the highway, in the middle of nowhere, just a lonely spot for travelers to stop for gas and snacks. A few old trucks and beat-up cars were scattered around, some of them clearly having made long journeys, others seemingly forgotten and left to collect dust. Jack Turner, in his late 30s, stood behind the counter, wiping down the glass with slow, methodical movements. His hands were steady as they slid over the surface of the countertop, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the small-town life he had settled into after his career in the CIA. He wasn't thinking about the long, lonely hours behind the counter or the way the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. No, today Jack was lost in the thoughts of a different time, a different world. The door to the gas station jingled, pulling him back to the present. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here. And before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story." He glanced up, expecting the usual, another passerby grabbing snacks and fuel. What he didn't expect was the group of college students that walked in, loud, boisterous, and carrying the weight of their privilege like a crown. They wore designer clothes, their expensive sunglasses perched on their noses like badges of honor, and their laughter echoed across the nearly empty store. The leader of the group, a tall, well-dressed guy with shaggy blonde hair and a smug look on his face, walked up to the counter with a swagger that immediately grated on Jack's nerves. He looked like he had stepped off the pages of some glossy magazine, a perfect picture of entitlement and arrogance. The other three followed, each carrying a drink or a snack, their eyes already scanning the store like it was beneath them. "Hey, how's it going?" the leader said to Jack, his tone almost mocking, though he flashed a smile that was more of a grin than anything genuine. "This place looks like it's stuck in the past, huh? You still pumping gas manually around here?" Jack didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the register, his fingers tapping lightly on the counter. The young man wasn't asking a question, he was making a statement. But Jack knew better than to react, so he simply nodded, giving no more than a polite, "Yep, still the same, just like it's been for years." The man smirked, looking around the store with a kind of casual disdain. "I can tell. You know, it's a shame people like you get stuck in places like this." He gestured to the shelves of chips and drinks, as if they were relics of a bygone era. "I mean, how do you even make it on a salary like that? Pretty sure I couldn't do it." Jack's expression remained neutral, but his jaw tightened slightly. The others in the group snickered, clearly enjoying the little power play they were getting from the encounter. One of the girls, dressed in a tight skirt and high heels that had no business being worn on a dusty highway, shot Jack a look of pity, like he was some unfortunate soul whose life had never amounted to anything more than serving people like them. Jack didn't bite. He'd dealt with this kind of condescension before. He knew exactly who these kids were, privileged, entitled, and far too used to getting what they wanted without having to earn it. They looked down on anyone who wasn't part of their world, anyone who worked for a living instead of enjoying the fruits of their parents' wealth. But that didn't mean Jack was going to take their crap. He wasn't some kid who could be pushed around by words and sneers. He'd dealt with much worse in his life than the arrogant remarks of a few rich kids. But they weren't done yet. The blonde guy Brad stepped closer to the counter, leaning in just a bit too close, making sure to loom over Jack in a show of power. "Tell me, man," Brad began, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "How's it feel to know that no matter how hard you work, you'll always be stuck in this dead-end job? You'll never make it to the top. No fancy cars, no vacations in Europe, just pumping gas for guys like me." The words hit harder than Jack expected. He felt the sting of the insult, even if he didn't show it. He had lived a life that most people wouldn't understand, a life that had left him scarred and tired. And yet, here he was, hiding behind the walls of a gas station, trying to leave behind a life that had nearly destroyed him. Brad leaned back, taking a moment to assess the effect of his words, clearly enjoying himself. The other kids stood behind him, laughing quietly, clearly reveling in Jack's discomfort. They were the kind of people who liked to feel superior, to look down on the world beneath them as though it were their personal playground. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Jack wasn't just some ordinary clerk. He wasn't just a nobody in a dead-end job. Jack had lived through things that would make their comfortable little lives crumble in an instant. He had been a CIA operative, involved in missions that required more than just intelligence. It required the kind of strength and training that only a select few ever experienced. He had been to places far worse than this quiet gas station, had seen things that couldn't be unseen. But he didn't want to be that man anymore. Brad's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. You know, you really should smile more. Life's too short to be this miserable. You might even get a better job if you tried. Jack's pulse quickened, his eyes narrowing just slightly. The irritation that had been bubbling beneath the surface for so long began to rise, but he kept it in check. There was no need to react like they wanted him to. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a fight. But when Brad reached across the counter and knocked over the cup of coffee Jack had been drinking, spilling it onto the floor with a mocking laugh, something inside Jack snapped. "Enough," he said quietly, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity that made Brad pause. For a moment, the words hung in the air, cutting through the laughter. Jack stood tall, finally meeting Brad's eyes, his gaze unwavering. "You think you know everything about me, but you don't." Brad stepped back, raising an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? And what's that supposed to mean?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly reached for the rag behind the counter, wiping the spilled coffee from the floor, his movements deliberate. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he said softly, his voice low but firm. Brad smirked, clearly thinking Jack was just trying to save face. But there was something in Jack's demeanor that made him hesitate. The others were watching now, sensing that something was off. But the moment passed. Brad shrugged and turned away, muttering something under his breath. "Whatever, man. You're not worth it." He grabbed his drink, tossing a few bills on the counter, and walked out, his friends trailing behind him. As the door jingled shut behind them, the gas station was filled with an eerie silence. Jack stood there, staring after them, the quiet settling around him. They didn't know, and it was just as well. He didn't need them to know. But the feeling of being disrespected was something that still lingered in the air. They had mocked him, tried to break him down. But in the end, it was just another moment. Another moment of arrogance, easily shrugged off. The silence was broken by the low hum of the gas station's neon lights. Jack exhaled slowly, leaning against the counter as he glanced at the door one more time. They'd come, they'd taunted him, and they'd left. But there was something he couldn't shake, the nagging feeling that this time, it wouldn't be as easy to let go. The door jingled softly as the rich kids filed out, their laughter fading into the distance, but the weight of their words still hung in the air. Jack stood behind the counter, his fingers resting lightly on the edge, the sensation of the taunt still lingering in his chest. It wasn't just the mockery, it wasn't even the way they had laughed at him, poking fun at a life they couldn't comprehend. It was the ease with which they assumed they could treat him like less than a person, like he was invisible. For a moment, Jack stood still, the low hum of the lights above him the only sound. He didn't need to react. He hadn't needed to react. And yet, the feeling that had followed him through his years in the CIA, the instinct to protect himself, to defend his honor, was clawing its way to the surface. He took a slow breath, exhaling it like smoke, trying to push the anger back down. But anger was something Jack had learned to suppress. It wasn't that he was afraid of it, it was that he knew where anger could lead. He had seen it firsthand in the years he had spent as a CIA operative, witnessed the destruction it left behind in its wake. So he pushed the feeling down, buried it, like he always had. He wasn't that man anymore. The mission was over. The past was over. And yet, as he glanced at the counter where they had spilled his coffee, the rage was still simmering just beneath the surface. He wiped at the mess again, this time with a little more force, his hand tightening around the rag. As he worked, his mind wandered. He'd been in worse situations, much worse. The things he had done for the agency, the lives he had taken, the lives he had saved, they all felt like a distant dream now. He was a different person, but the memories were never far behind. He had thought once that working in the shadows, running missions, being part of something greater than himself would give him purpose. But now, all he wanted was to fade into the background. A quiet life, a peaceful life, a life untouched by the chaos that had once been his. He finished cleaning the counter, standing still for a moment, but the quiet was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot. His fingers tightened around the rag, but he didn't look up immediately. It wasn't the rich kids. They were gone. No, this car was different. Darker, sleek, with tinted windows. The low rumble of the engine was steady, deliberate. Jack's pulse quickened. He didn't have to see who was in the car to know. He could feel it, that gut instinct honed over years of training and experience. The same feeling he had gotten on missions when things were about to go south. It wasn't paranoia. It was a sense of awareness that came from having lived through too much. The car stopped just short of the pumps, the headlights cutting across the pavement in sharp contrast to the fading light of day. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. His body was still, but his senses were alert, instinctively aware. He reached under the counter, his fingers brushing the handle of the old revolver he kept tucked there for emergencies. It was a habit from his old life, when he never knew when danger would rear its head. He didn't want to use it. He didn't need to use it. But the tension that had been building since the encounter with the rich kids was still lingering, gnawing at him, urging him to prepare. The door opened, the soft jingling of the bell above signaling someone's entry. Jack stood still, his posture unchanged, his gaze fixed ahead. He knew better than to make the first move. Whoever it was wouldn't show their hand right away. A tall figure entered the gas station. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, his face concealed in shadow. He moved with purpose, his gait steady and measured. He didn't look like someone who had come for gas or snacks. There was no casual air about him. He was here for something, and Jack could feel it in the way his presence filled the room. The man approached the counter, his eyes locking with Jack's, unblinking. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle, but his mind was racing. The man's appearance was a contrast to the brashness of the rich kids earlier. This man was calm, calculating, and familiar in a way that made Jack's stomach tighten. There was something about him that triggered a flash of memory, but Jack couldn't place it. The man didn't speak immediately, his gaze never leaving Jack's face. Jack remained still, the weight of the silence hanging between them. After a moment, the stranger finally broke the silence. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low, smooth, and steady. "For a man with a history, you sure like to keep to the shadows." Jack's body stiffened. The words hit him like a punch, but he didn't show it. He kept his voice even, though his mind was working in overdrive, searching for answers, trying to piece together who this man was and why he was here. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack said, his tone cool, controlled. The man chuckled softly, and Jack could hear the subtle hint of recognition in the sound. "No one really knows how much of the past gets buried, do they?" He stepped closer to the counter, his eyes flicking over Jack, sizing him up. "I'm not here to drag you back, Jack. I just need you to understand something. There's unfinished business. People like you, people who think they can walk away from the game, they don't just fade out quietly. The world doesn't let you." Jack's breath caught in his throat, his grip tightening around the counter. The man knew. He knew who Jack had been, what Jack had done. And that made everything shift. There was no running anymore. The silence stretched between them, but Jack's mind was already working through the options. It was happening. The past had finally caught up to him. He had known, deep down, that he couldn't outrun it forever. The danger, the violence, the people he had left behind, it was all returning now, and he had no choice but to face it. The man seemed to read the change in Jack's expression. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I'm here to offer you a chance to finish what you started. You can walk away again, but it won't matter. They'll find you. They always find the ones who try to hide." Jack's mind flashed back to the operations he had run, the missions that had taken him to the darkest corners of the world, the CIA, the Black Ops, the dirty work. He had done it all, but he had also paid the price, leaving it all behind when the walls closed in, when the lies became too much. And now, the walls were closing in again. "I'm not who I was," Jack said, his voice firm. "I've left that life behind." The man smiled, but it was more a knowing smile than a reassuring one. "No one ever truly leaves the life, Jack. You should know that by now." Jack stood motionless behind the counter, the weight of the stranger's words pressing down on him. His breath came slower now, measured, but his pulse raced in the back of his mind, the memories of old missions rising like ghosts in the shadows of his thoughts. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to find him, to pull him back into a life he had carefully buried. The man in front of him remained still, his expression unreadable, but there was a knowingness in his eyes that made Jack's stomach tighten. He had been here before. He had seen men like this. Men who knew how to get under your skin, how to chip away at the walls you had built to keep them out. "I told you, I'm done with that life," Jack repeated, his voice steady, though there was a hint of finality in it. He had left it all behind for a reason. He couldn't go back. He wouldn't. "Whatever you think is going on here, it's not my problem." The man's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. He leaned in slightly, his voice soft, but cutting through the air like a blade. "You really think it's that simple? You think they'll just leave you alone because you're standing behind this counter, serving gas and snacks? You think that will keep them from coming for you?" Jack's jaw tightened, his hands slowly curling into fists beneath the counter. He wasn't used to being cornered. He wasn't used to being reminded of the life he'd walked away from. But there was a part of him, deep inside, that couldn't ignore the truth of the man's words. "They never stop coming for you, do they?" Jack said quietly, almost to himself. His mind drifted to the days when he had been part of the agency, when he had been a tool for them to use and discard, sent on dangerous missions that no one else could handle. He had done things he didn't like to remember, things that had haunted him in the darkest corners of his mind. The stranger, who had been watching Jack carefully, finally took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. "You've got it. They never stop. But it's not just about you anymore, Jack. This isn't about you hiding in some little gas station, pretending to be just another clerk. They've found you, and now they want something from you." Jack's breath caught in his throat as the man's words sank in. There had been whispers in the past, rumors he'd overheard in dimly lit corners, but Jack had drowned it all out. He had buried it deep, convincing himself that his past was behind him. But the truth was, the agency, the people he had once worked for, didn't let go. They didn't let anyone walk away. "You're still part of the game," the stranger said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Whether you like it or not. And they won't stop until they get what they want." Jack's hands gripped the counter harder now, his knuckles white. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, but through it all, one thing remained clear. He couldn't go back. He couldn't return to the man he was. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack said, his voice low but firm, fighting to maintain control over the storm threatening to break loose inside him. "You're wasting your time." The stranger sighed and reached into his jacket pocket. Jack's eyes narrowed, his muscles tensing in instinctive readiness. But the man didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small file, the edges worn and creased, and set it down on the counter. It landed with a quiet thud, but the weight of it was enough to make Jack freeze. "You don't get to walk away from this," the man said, his voice more insistent now. "This is bigger than you, Jack, and whether you like it or not, you're still involved." Jack didn't move. The file sat there between them, like a decision hanging in the air. He stared at it, but there was no curiosity in his gaze. He had seen enough files in his life to recognize the significance. This was a call to action, a call to return, a reminder that the past had its claws buried deep inside of him, no matter how hard he tried to shake it off. He looked up at the man, his voice suddenly quiet. "I left. I'm not that man anymore. I don't know what you want from me, but whatever it is, it's not happening." The stranger's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "You don't get to decide that. Not anymore." He leaned in just slightly, his eyes locked onto Jack's. "They're coming, and they're coming for you, for what you know, for what you did." Jack felt his heart skip a beat, a cold shiver running down his spine. The truth was sinking in, cold and heavy, like a lead weight dragging him back toward a world he had long buried. They knew. They knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. "I've been living with the consequences of what I did," Jack said, his voice tight, his fists still clenched. "I don't need your file. I don't need your threats. I'm done. You should go." But the man didn't move. He just watched Jack for a moment longer, a quiet understanding passing between them. Then, slowly, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty store. He paused at the door and glanced back, one last time, his expression unreadable. "You'll come around," he said, almost as an afterthought. "You always do. They're not going to stop, Jack. You're a part of something much bigger than you ever realized." With that, he was gone, leaving the door to swing gently closed behind him. Jack stood in the quiet of the gas station, staring at the file on the counter, His heart was pounding now, the tension in his chest palpable. His mind raced, thinking of the life he had tried so hard to leave behind. He knew what this meant. He knew what would come next. The life he had built in this quiet town, the peaceful existence he had tried so desperately to hold on to, was slipping through his fingers. The past wasn't done with him yet. Jack reached for the file, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a dossier, names, dates, operations, all things he thought he had forgotten. But they were never forgotten. They couldn't be. And now they had come for him. He closed the file with a slow, deliberate movement, his face hardening. The game had started again. The quiet of the gas station felt oppressive now, almost suffocating. Jack stood behind the counter, staring at the file in his hands. The words blurred as his mind raced. His thoughts collided, memories and fears rising up like a tidal wave. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his life, his peace, were crumbling. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't asked for this return to his old life. Yet here it was, knocking at his door, dragging him back into a world that would never let go. He hadn't expected the stranger to come back, to remind him of everything he thought he had outrun. The thought of it, the people he had worked for, the missions he had executed, the lives he had taken, and the ones he had saved, felt like a weight he couldn't carry anymore. The quiet farm life he'd worked so hard to carve out for himself suddenly felt fragile. His palms were sweaty as he closed the file and shoved it back into the drawer beneath the counter. But no matter how much he tried to push it away, the pull of the past remained. His fingers tightened around the drawer's edge, his heart racing. The door jingled again, the sound cutting through the heavy silence. But Jack didn't flinch this time. He had already prepared himself. They were coming for him. The question was no longer if, but when. A familiar car pulled up, the sound of tires grinding on the gravel. Jack didn't need to look outside to know who it was. The engine sounded too powerful, too deliberate. And when he heard the footsteps approaching the door, slow but firm, he knew his time had run out. The door swung open with a soft creak, and this time, there was no uncertainty, no hidden agenda. The figure who stepped inside wasn't the stranger from earlier, but someone much more familiar. A former CIA operative, someone Jack had worked with in the past, someone he thought he'd never have to face again. His name was Dean Lawson. Dean was a man Jack had once trusted, a man who had saved his life more than once. But that was before the betrayal, before the lies, before the day Jack had made the decision to walk away from it all. Dean's eyes locked onto Jack's instantly, cold but calculating. "You knew this was coming," he said, his voice low, rough, like a man who had been chewing on the same bitter truth for years. His eyes flicked to the file still sitting in the drawer, but he didn't make a move for it. He didn't need to. Jack remained still, his breath slow and steady, but inside, his mind was racing. "What do you want, Dean?" he asked, his voice tight with restraint. He had no illusions about the man standing in front of him. Dean wasn't here to catch up, to reminisce about old missions. He was here for something, and Jack wasn't in the mood to play games anymore. Dean smiled faintly, the expression more menacing than friendly. "You know why I'm here?" he said, his voice colder now, almost as if he were speaking to a stranger, not a former partner. "You think you can just disappear, live your little life in peace. But that's not how this works. They've found you, Jack. They know what you know, and they're coming for you." Jack's pulse quickened, the weight of Dean's words sinking in like a stone. He had hoped, for just a moment, that he could remain invisible, that he could fade into the shadows and be forgotten. But they had never truly left him alone. The CIA, the agency that had used him, trained him, and then discarded him, had always kept one eye on its assets, and Jack had been one of their top operatives. His skills, his knowledge, were too valuable to let slip away. "Let them come," Jack said quietly, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not involved anymore. I walked away. I'm not your pawn anymore, Dean. I'm not anyone's pawn." Dean's expression hardened, his jaw clenched. He didn't speak right away, just stared at Jack as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, with a sigh, he moved closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Jack didn't flinch. He stood his ground, but the reality of the situation hit him like a wave. He was done running. The question wasn't whether they would come. It was when they would finally catch up with him. And they would. "You don't understand, do you?" Dean said finally, his voice thick with frustration. "You think they'll just let you live out the rest of your life on some farm, pretending everything's fine? They know about the intel you have, the operations you ran. You're too valuable, Jack. You'll never be free of them, not until they've gotten everything they want from you." Jack stared at him, the tension between them palpable. He felt the rage building, the old instincts rising to the surface, but he kept them in check. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to go back. He had spent so many years training himself to let go of the violence, to move on, but now, standing here in front of Dean, in this dingy gas station, it felt like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape from. "I don't care what they want," Jack said, his voice low but filled with an undeniable edge. "I'm done with them, and if they want me, they'll have to come for me, but not here, not now." Dean stepped closer, his eyes flicking toward the door, where the distant sound of a car approaching could be heard. "They're already here, Jack," he said softly, almost regretfully. "You've been marked. You've always been marked. No matter how far you run, they'll find you." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to look out the window. The sun had set now, the darkness of night beginning to creep over the land, but he could feel it. The encroaching danger, the sense that his life was about to spiral out of control again. The quiet farm, the peaceful life, all of it felt like a dream now. In the distance, the headlights of several cars came into view. Jack's stomach clenched. He didn't need to see them to know who they were. Dean stepped back, his face cold, detached, but there was something almost sad in his expression. "You should have stayed away from this life, Jack. You should have stayed hidden, but you didn't. And now, you have to face it." Jack turned back to him, his voice low and firm. "I'll face whatever comes, but this time, I won't do it alone." And as the headlights of the cars neared, Jack knew the quiet, simple life he had fought for was over. The past had finally caught up with him, and this time, there was no hiding. The low hum of the approaching cars grew louder, a relentless sound that made Jack's muscles tense. He didn't look out the window again. There was no point in pretending he didn't already know who they were. The flash of headlights cutting through the gathering darkness was unmistakable. They were here. Dean didn't move. He stood by the door, his eyes flicking between Jack and the shadowy outline of the cars in the distance. "It's too late now, Jack," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper in the oppressive silence. "You're not running this time. You're not walking away." Jack felt the bitterness twist in his gut, a sour taste rising in the back of his throat. He had known it was inevitable. He had tried to convince himself that he could stay hidden, live a life that didn't involve the shadows and the lies, but now, here it was. The very thing he had been avoiding, the thing he feared most. The door opened with a soft creak, and Jack's gaze shifted to the newcomer. 3 men stepped inside, their figures filling the doorway. 2 of them were tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark suits. The third was smaller, but just as imposing. His sharp eyes scanned the room quickly, then locked onto Jack with the kind of predatory focus Jack had once known all too well. The smallest of the 3, a man with graying hair and a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, his expression cold, calculating. He was the one in charge. "Jack Turner," the man said, his voice thick with authority. "We need to have a word." Jack didn't move. He stayed behind the counter, his hands steady but his mind whirring, looking for an escape, a way out. But he knew there was none. There was nowhere left to run. "I told you," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "I'm done with the game. I'm not going back. Not for you, not for anyone." The man smiled, a thin, humorless smile. "You don't get to make that choice anymore," he said. His eyes flicked briefly toward Dean, then back to Jack. "The agency made you. The agency owns you. You don't get to leave, Jack, and you don't get to decide when this is over." Jack's stomach twisted. He could feel the weight of his past pressing in on him, suffocating him. The agency, they had always been there, always lurking in the background, pulling the strings, controlling everything. They had used him, shaped him into the perfect weapon, then cast him aside when they no longer had use for him. They had taken everything from him, and now they were here to finish what they had started. "I don't belong to them anymore," Jack said, his voice firm despite the panic creeping beneath it. "I'm out, and I'm not going back." The man's smile didn't falter, but the coldness in his eyes deepened. He took a step closer to the counter, leaning in just enough to make Jack uncomfortable. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said softly. "They don't let their people go, and they don't let anyone walk away alive who knows what you know. You're a liability, Jack, a loose end that needs to be tied up." Jack's heart raced, his instincts kicking into overdrive. This was it. He had known it would come to this, but the finality of the words still stung, still cut through him like a blade. He had spent years trying to bury his past, and now it was standing right in front of him, demanding answers. The man turned to the two others behind him. "Take him," he ordered, his tone cold and clipped. Before Jack could react, the two men lunged forward, moving with precision, train speed that was impossible to match. Jack ducked instinctively, his body twisting in a fluid motion. As one of the men reached for him, he slammed his fist into the man's stomach, the force of the punch knocking the wind out of him, but it wasn't enough. The second man grabbed Jack from behind, pinning his arms to his sides, holding him in a vice-like grip. The room was spinning, the adrenaline surging through Jack's veins. He had been in situations like this before, situations where the odds were against him, where he had been cornered. His training kicked in, quick, instinctive. He lifted his knee sharply, catching the man behind him in the stomach, then twisted out of his grip, landing a powerful elbow to his jaw. But the two men were relentless. The third man, the one who had spoken, stepped back, watching with a cold, calculating gaze, as if he were studying a predator trying to break free. Jack knew this was it. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to end it. Jack's mind raced for a plan. He was faster than they were. He was stronger. But there were too many of them. He had no choice but to fight, but even as he lashed out, the weight of his past seemed to bear down on him like an anchor. He landed another punch, but the second man grabbed his wrist and twisted, sending a shock of pain through his body. Jack's breath hitched as he stumbled, struggling to regain his footing. The fight wasn't going his way. He glanced toward the door, the only possible escape, but it was too late. The third man had already moved, standing between Jack and the exit, his gun raised, pointed directly at him. Jack's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't freeze. He had been trained for moments like this. "Last chance," the man said, his voice barely a whisper. "Come with us, or we make it worse." Jack's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the gun, the pressure building in his chest. His body screamed at him to act, but for the first time in a long time, his mind was clouded with doubt. The past, the old missions, the things he had done, they were all coming back to him now, and with them, the haunting knowledge that there was no escape from this life. But something inside him snapped. He wasn't going down without a fight. He couldn't, not after everything he had survived. With a sudden burst of strength, Jack lunged at the man with the gun, knocking it out of his hand and sending it skidding across the floor. The other two men tried to move in, but Jack spun around, his fists flying in a blur of motion, his training coming to life again. His body moved on its own, instinct taking over as he fought with a desperation he hadn't felt in years. In a matter of seconds, the room was chaos, the sounds of fists colliding with flesh, the thud of bodies hitting the floor, the rush of adrenaline clouding everything. Jack was moving faster than he ever had before, the world around him a blur of violence and instinct. He didn't think about the past anymore. He didn't think about who they were or what they wanted from him. He only thought about surviving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack stood in the middle of the room, panting, his heart racing. The three men were on the floor, incapacitated but not unconscious. They would be out for a while, but they weren't dead. Jack hadn't killed them. Not this time. He wasn't that man anymore. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how long he could keep running, how long he could keep fighting. But one thing was clear. This fight was far from over. As Jack stood there, chest heaving, staring down at the men he had just taken down, the truth settled over him like a heavy blanket. His past was never going to let him go, and he was never going to be free.